folks, tourism researchers, and volcanologists, tsunami experts, and other interesting folks. So his exciting seminar today has the title of Hey You, Get Onto My Cloud, Going from Bottom of the Sea to Outer Space. Please join me in welcoming Ulrich.
Thank you, Yun-Sing, and kia ora tātou. Ulrich Speidel, I hope. And yeah, I've been introduced, so let's dive straight in. So what, please, is a cloud? Do you guys know? Right, blank faces. Not surprised, because that term cloud computing has been around for probably about 10, 15 years, something like that. I'm not exactly sure when it crept in. And to this very day, I don't really know fully what it means. So quite why I got invited today, I'm not entirely sure. But so cheapest way to getting onto the cloud is by one of these boxes. They come from different manufacturers, and they're called personal clouds. And are these really clouds? Yeah, according to them they are, but basically it's just basically marketing speak. It's not what I would call a cloud. So for the purposes of this talk, a cloud is a distributed system of computers offering processing, storage, or data delivery capacity to service providers on the one hand and end users on the other. And this is important for this talk because this is where it's all going to revolve around. That's being accessed via the internet. So all those USB cable devices that we've just seen on the previous slides, they don't count. Okay, so what I mean by processing, so you've probably heard about things like Amazon Web Services. Do we have anyone from Amazon here today? No? Okay. I understand there was somebody meant to come, but they got COVID or something. Don't know. So basically, what you do with Amazon Web Services, you go out and you hire yourself processing capacity. So basically, you get a computer somewhere on the cloud or something that looks like a computer to you that you can log in. And they'll give you scalable processing capacity based on a certain number of CPUs that you request and a certain amount of memory that you require, and then a certain amount of storage, like hard drive capacity or nominal hard drive capacity. But in reality, it's not a physical computer. It's distributed typically over a number of machines that sit in one or more data centers, and this is entirely transparent to you. So you can put your website there, or do your compute tasks or whatever you want to do. So also, there's the concept of cloud storage, and you probably all use one of these, either Google Drive or Dropbox or Microsoft OneDrive or Apple iCloud. All of these are basically cloud-based storage. And as you probably know, if you happen to be on a not so great internet connection, getting large files on and off that cloud storage is a bit of an issue. Right? So again, you need a good internet connection to do this. So last but not least, we're talking about delivery capacity. So this is the ability of a cloud service provider from their machines, from their networks, to deliver large amounts of data efficiently to end users that you want to serve. So the typical application there is web services and websites. And the idea is that the cloud allows you to bring these services very, very close topologically to your users. So that, for example, say I'm a great fan of the BBC World Service. So when I look at the BBC World Service website, and of course everybody knows it's London calling, so they sit in London. But in reality, when I look at their website, it's being served to me from a server here in Auckland. So the files get to me really, really quickly. And moreover, they don't have to travel all the way between London and here every time somebody here looks at it. So that actually takes quite a bit of load off the international network. So cloud service providers are companies that a lot of people haven't actually heard of. So there's names like Fastly or Cloudflare or Akamai, and there's quite a few more. And the ones that I just mentioned earlier on, Amazon Web Services, and so they also all provide mixed products that fall into that bracket. And yeah. So when one of these cloud service providers fails, and you look at the media, the first thing that you hear is, The internet's broken down. Right? This is fake news. The internet was actually operational from the 1st of January last year to the 31st of December inclusive. It never broke down. What broke down on the 6th of June, I think it was Fastly, one of those cloud service delivery providers. There's these content delivery networks. And because there were so many websites that were being served through them, basically, it was experienced by a lot of people, like almost every website or a lot of websites that they looked at didn't work. So the internet was down, when in reality the internet worked perfectly. It was just Fastly that had problems. So now, what does this tell us? It tells us a couple of things. Well, firstly, we need good internet in order to access stuff like this, and in order to also be able to host those cloud service providers locally in a particular place. So let me just explain how New Zealand gets its internet at the moment. And basically 99.9% of internet traffic in New Zealand comes via one of those fiber optic cables. Currently, there's 4 of them in operation. So this is the, oops, sorry. Go away. So, oh, no. Yeah, here we go. So this is the Southern Cross cable that goes up to Hawaii, and that actually backtracks over to Sydney, and then there's another branch that goes up to Hawaii and from to Fiji, and from Fiji on to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii there's a cross connect between the 2 branches that end up in Hawaii, and there's 2 branches also that go off to the US mainland, and there's a connection between the 2 connection points of the Southern Cross cable at the west coast. So it's a true figure of 8. Which basically means you can cut any of those cables and the system itself will still work. You just got to drive it backwards to a certain extent. So you can still get there. So since the Southern Cross cable was built in the 1990s, it's been upgraded a few times. Upgrading a submarine fiber optic cable is typically done not by upgrading the cable itself, but by upgrading the terminal equipment at the endpoints of the cable. So they do over time as this equipment evolves. They do evolve over time to be, providing more and more capacity. But even so, there's competition that sprung up. So the first, come on, I'm on the wrong button here again. Okay. So the competition that sprung up is the first one that sprung up was the Hawaii cable. And then there's also the Tasman Global Access Cable. So the Hawaii cable runs, as you might guess from the name, runs up to Hawaii. And it has a branching point in the middle of the Tasman Sea. One branch goes over to Sydney, other branch goes over to Mangawhai Heads. And the Tasman Global Access, or Surfer Line for short, that ends up in Raglan. And Sydney, as you can see, is quite an important point of presence. And then there's a few domestic cables floating around here as well, but since we're in Auckland, we don't usually use those, so I'm just going to skip those for the moment. So talking about cables, what do these cables look like? So as you can see, there's actually a new cable here that I haven't mentioned. It's this one here. This is the Southern Cross Next cable, and this is meant to go live at the end of June, or I can't remember, 30th of June or 1st of July. It's already been laid, and I'm very privileged today to be able to show you a piece of that. So to give you a bit of an idea, this thing is a piece of the Southern Cross Next submarine fiber optic cable. It's 20 centimeters long, weighs about 800 grams. So what this means in practice is that a kilometer of that thing weighs about 4 tons. So it's not something you want to be putting into the back of your car, apart from the fact that it wouldn't fit there. So to give you a bit of an idea what that looks like structure-wise, and unfortunately we haven't been able to get the camera working here, but what you're looking at is about a 1 millimeter channel in the middle. This is where the actual fiber runs, and this one's lost its fiber. And around that, you'll notice that there's a very, very sort of fine strained protective steel cable that runs around it. And around that, you'll find there's a little copper ring. The copper ring powers the repeaters along the way of the cable, and there's, I think, 200 or something like that along the way. So they're basically putting high voltage in at one end, and every repeater takes a few volts out of that high voltage. In the end, they're grounded at the far end of the cable. So around that, you'll find a bit of plastic protection and insulation, and then you find a really strong multi-wire steel cable around it, which is essentially soaked in what must be bitumen or something like this, and then around that there's a layer of fabric, again sort of soaked in some sort of plastic, for protection, corrosion protection and this sort of thing. And that is really required. So when a cable ship like this, like the Reliance here, lays the cable has to support its own weight until it touches the seafloor. And when you're looking at the Pacific, a lot of the Pacific has a seafloor depth of about 5,000 meters. So, and given the fact that you're really pulling the cable behind the ship to a certain extent, you can be looking at 10, 20 kilometers worth of cable having to support its own weight until it hits the seafloor. So you're looking at quite a few tons, and this is why you're needing, quite that much steel. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass this around so you can all have a look at it. Please do return it to me. I want to show this to my students in the second semester. Okay, so or if you'd like to have a look at a complete cable, the old Southern Cross cable is in our Computer Science Museum. Quick plug, if you haven't had a look at this, it's over in the Computer Science building and it spreads over several floors. This is on ground floor on the connecting corridor between the inner courtyard and building 303.
Do you want the cable back?
Oh, yes. Right, so if you find yourself in Hawaii, who's been to Hawaii? Show of hands. Okay, who's been to Big Island, Hawaii? Okay, now if you work in data communications, you can be excused for a bit of hacker tourism. So there's this Samuel M. Spencer Beach Park, which is a fairly unremarkable beach park on the western side, the leeward side of Big Island. And this is where the Southern Cross cable from Takapuna lands, and it's roughly lands where that arrow is. It's not like you could see anything. They've buried this really well, and I would not suggest that you take your grandkids or kids or anyone there to dig it out. Of course, remember, high voltage. And I actually had to go to a museum that's on the other side of that park and find the longest serving ranger there to inquire of him as to where that cable was actually laid, because all the younger staff didn't know. And it runs from there up the hill to a Hawaii Telecom cable landing station, which is a sort of big industrial-looking building. So basically, if you do data communications, you get to see nice places from time to time. Okay, so getting back to Fastly and so on. So basically, if you want to benefit from their services as an end user, you really want to be topologically near one of those points of presence. Of course, that's where they keep their servers, that's where your websites, that's where your YouTube videos, or not necessarily YouTube videos, but that's where your videos, that's where your content sits. And you want to have really good connection between one of those points and yourself. So, and of course you want this thing to be working too, but let's assume it's working. So, and let's assume that what we want to do is we want to have a look at a cat video. And of course, cat videos are among the most shared videos on the planet. So we're going to work with cat videos now. And so let's assume for a moment we're sitting somewhere on a remote Pacific island in a nice resort, and we're having our pina colada having been served to us, and we're just relaxing. Us academics, by the way, don't get to do this. We're too lowly paid for that. But for all practical purposes, some people do, and then they sit there and they basically want to go and upload their video to the cloud. And questions, how do they do this? Now, depending on where you sit, you might be lucky if you're in the Cook Islands, if you're in Rarotonga or Aitutaki, you'll get cable. But if you're not in places like this, or some islands in Fiji, then basically the only way that you can get internet there is via satellite. And there's essentially two types of satellite that your signal might go across. The first one are geostationary satellites. And this is what a geostationary satellite sees roughly from 35,700 or 36,000, I can't ever remember high 30,000s kilometers above the surface of the Earth in a so-called geostationary or geo-orbit and sitting above the equator. And this is what a satellite sees when it sits above the Pacific. So for all practical purposes, it sees a lot of places that already have cable, like Hawaii, North America, New Zealand, Australia. And it sees very, very few specs with relatively few customers. And as a result of that, there aren't actually all that many satellites of that sort over the Pacific. And the ones that there are there, they charge like wounded bulls when it comes to service. When they have a contract with a local ISP, internet service provider, then that's usually a commercial secret. But if you're in the industry, you know that we're typically looking upwards of $200 US per megabit per second of capacity per month. And if you compare that to your home internet connection, you suddenly realize that this is the equivalent of paying around about $5,000 US a month for a typical home internet connection. And so as a result of that, this is a bit tough. Now, a few years ago, about 2014, 2015, new provider turned up, O3b, and they're serving from medium Earth orbit. Now, medium Earth orbit has the advantage that it's a bit closer to Earth. So we can actually reuse the frequency spectrum a bit better around there. We also don't have such a long path, so the satellite doesn't have to transmit with quite that much power in order to get there. So all great things. At the ground side, it's beneficial because it means we can get away with much, much smaller antennas. We'll see that in a moment. But the antennas need to track. And you can't just send one satellite up there because geostationary orbit means geostationary, so it's literally sitting above one spot on the equator continuously, whereas if you're in medium Earth orbit, you're actually moving along the equator. And so this means that watching from the ground, those medium Earth orbit satellites, they rise and then they eventually set. So you need more than one satellite. They started off with 4, I think they're now up to about 16 or 20. But basically, you need to track those satellites, and for that, you need a minimum of 2 antennas on the ground. So this is what the sort of setup looks like on a place like Aitutaki. This was in 2015. So their old system was an 8 megabit per second geostationary satellite using this big fixed dish here. And the new system that they just commissioned was an O3b system that, depending on whether you were tracking 1 or 2 satellites, would give you up to 40 or 80 megabits per second from those antennas. And you can see all the mechanics behind those antennas, and that's what's actually required to track those satellites. And as you can see, it's also pretty close to road level. And when we were doing measurements there, we were noticing that they had these inexplicable second-long outages during the middle of the night. And we figured out later on that this road around here is actually the road to the local hospital. And this was the ambulance going out in the middle of the night, driving along the road. High-sided metal vehicle was interrupting the signal path. So, yeah. But anyway, what does this all mean? Now, Aitutaki has a population of, depending on who you talk to, and whether you include tourists or not, of a couple of thousand. And so it's sort of a bit of a constant, well, not necessarily constant, it's growing. But at the moment, your typical internet user on this planet, and this is a matter of how you really define it, but it's a good rule of thumb, your typical internet user takes about 1 megabit per second worth of capacity 24/7 hours a day, 24/7 and 365 days a year. And so this means if you've got 1,700 people on an island, then you'd really want to have a bandwidth of round about 1.7 gigabits available for all of them for adequate service. However, you can see that with 8 megabits per second, or up to 2 times 40 megabits per second, we're really badly undersupplying here. But again, anything more than that is price-wise quite prohibitive. So, hang on, where's this going? Wrong way around. Okay. So, right. So the other thing is, once you have a satellite link and you're an ISP and you're distributing this to a large number of users, you run into another problem. And that other problem is that the Internet's most common transport protocol, or still most common transport protocol, TCP, doesn't really like going through those long delay bottlenecks that are satellite links. And when you do this with a large number of users, you get an effect called Tcpq oscillation. And what this means in practice is that when those users are simultaneously active, your output goes down, and the number of packets lost at the input queue to the satellite goes up, or input queues to the satellite link, not to the satellite itself. And we can see this here in a multi-day experiment that we ran in 2015. So basically, this red curve shows our output, and in the middle of the night when nobody's active, sort of till the morning hours, we're getting pretty good output on our experiments, and then during the day it gets really depressed, and depressing for that matter. And while the output goes down, our packet loss goes up. And I should say with the packet loss here, this is on a logarithmic scale. So we're talking about this going up orders of magnitude. So we've been working a bit on trying to address that with the network coding that Yun Sing was referring to. I'm not going to talk much about that today, though, because there's something else that I want to fill the time with. It's a bit more current and a bit more recent. So basically, this is what the distribution model of your typical medium Earth orbit or geostationary satellite looks like. So you have a link. It's coming in from a satellite, and it goes down to some ISP on the island, and the ISP then sort of distributes the traffic to the user. So what does this mean? In its bare bones configuration, it means that if you're watching a cat video, it has to come down the satellite link, and then it has to go down the link from the internet service provider's data center to the end user. So if a second user wants to have a look at the same cat video, then it has to come down the link a second time. And remember, the link itself is a very, very constrained capacity. We want to keep as much traffic as possible off this. So what we can in principle do here, and this is what we're doing here in New Zealand, even with our high capacity international fiber links, is we put a content delivery network server somewhere locally, typically either at the ISP or close to the ISP. And that's where the first copy of the cat video that arrives on the island gets cached, and then if several end users want it, they get redirected to that CDN server and they download it to their local machines. Advantage is there, if it goes viral on the island, we have hundreds of people looking at it. There's only one copy that has to go via the satellite link. Everything else is handled locally by the CDN server. So we've conserved capacity on the link. So enter the new kid on the block. And who's heard of Starlink? Okay, who's heard of Elon Musk? Everybody has, Tesla and SpaceX and so on. Now Starlink is the internet, satellite internet division of SpaceX, and they've put over 2,000 satellites now in orbit to basically provide internet service. And they're quite different from any other internet service that's been offered from space so far, in that these are so-called low Earth orbit satellites. So unlike the medium Earth orbit satellites, which sit about 8,000 kilometers above the equator, these sit at any latitude between at the moment, 53 south and 53 north. And they fly at an altitude of round about 550 kilometers. And so what this means in practice is that we got a lot of them congregating around the 53rd parallel. So here's a look from the south. So you can see there's a lot more white dots. These are the satellites. There are a lot more white dots around the southern end of the range than there are over the Pacific. You can see the dot density down here is much, much larger. Why is this so? Very, very simple. When these satellites orbit, they're basically on a circular orbit around the Earth. They go up to 53 degrees north, come back to 53 degrees south, and in doing so, in a full orbit, they cross every parallel exactly twice, except for the 53rd, which I just touched. So what that means is, though, that the equator, being the longest parallel, therefore has the lowest density of crossings per kilometer of parallel, whereas at 53 degrees, which is the shortest of those parallels, or the shortest two of those parallels, or just under 53 degrees, which is the shortest of the parallels that we're flying over, they have the highest density, and so therefore you basically have most satellites kind of congregating there for a lot of time. Which means that if you're using Starlink, then you basically use this. And Ben, could I get you to just start the video on this one? Oh no, video, previous slide. Yep, okay. Cool. So what you can see, so this is accelerated by a factor of 15. So what you can see is the satellites either fly in a northeasterly direction or in a southeasterly direction, because this is the original Starlink configuration or constellation there. And so you can see that they move quite quickly, and because they're not that high up with 550 kilometers, it also means they move in and out of sight of ground stations really, really quickly. So what does this mean? Now let's have a quick look and see whether we can order Starlink for a place of interest. So I'm going to take you now to a place called Montana in the United States. And I'm going to take you to a place called Kalispell. Has anyone ever been to Kalispell, Montana? Great. Well, Mike, I know you would have been up there. You know this place. Okay, so you probably remember that it's not the biggest of all places, right? It's quite a, it's quite a small town, and it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. So, and given the fact that it's reasonably close to 53 degrees north, you should be getting pretty good service there, especially because it's surrounded by a number of gateways that Starlink uses. And by the way, does anyone know what the population of Montana is? I looked it up, it's just over 1 million. Okay, so, and yes, it's kind of available as long as you're willing to wait until 2023 till you get service. And this is because they've hit capacity in Kalispell. Now, why is this important? Now, you've probably all heard that Starlink is currently trying to provide internet service to Ukraine, and the way you read it in the media, you could get the idea that Starlink single-handedly will replace all of the other internet services in the Ukraine. And can I just quietly point out that they can't even serve everybody on Montana. Now, the Ukraine, even if you take all the refugees out that have left, they still have almost 40 million people left in the country. And they're only 1.5 times larger than Montana. You really believe they'll be able to replace the internet over there? I don't think so. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, they started publishing this coverage map. And in fact, if you go up to the northern US, you see those sort of few spots that basically are waitlisted. And Kalispell happens to be in one of those waitlisted spots. And in fact, if you zoom into that map, you notice it's essentially around all the population centers where American suburbanites sit, who previously have been sitting on cable modems, which are notoriously low bandwidth, and who'd love to get Starlink, and they can't get it because they haven't got enough system capacity up there. The other thing you neatly see here is that basically anyone or almost anyone who's around the tropics is essentially devoid of Starlink. There's virtually no gateways around there. Notable exceptions are Hawaii, which isn't actually on the screen here at the moment. And interestingly enough, the Chatham Islands. Despite the fact that the Chatham Islands are literally about 900 k's away from the closest gateway in Hines. So, hang on. Why is this? Oh yeah, so going the right way around. So essentially, this is Kalispell. Where did the other slide go? Disappear? No, it has disappeared. Anyway, so apparently you can get it in the Chatham Islands now, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be continuous connectivity because there's just not enough satellites continuously between mainland New Zealand and the Chatham Islands in order to continue guarantee continuous coverage. I mean, even here in Auckland, you apparently still get outages every few hours because there's not enough satellite coverage here. We're too far north. Anyway, so basically, if we want to improve connectivity in remote islands in the Pacific, will Starlink be our solution? And right, you may remember that little news story here from middle of January. This is Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai exploding in Tonga. And those of you who've known me for a while know that I've got a bit of a relation to Tonga in the sense that I had a PhD student from there, who was the first, Edward Koka, who was the first Tongan to get a PhD in computer science. And of course, this was highly interesting. And so when this thing went off, it was really, really interesting because the international cable that connects Tonga to Fiji went down. And it went down about an hour, 45 minutes after the eruption. And the eruption was literally initially a single burst, a single pulse from the volcano. And as you may remember, there were people uploading videos of the tsunami hitting Tonga Tapu. And they wouldn't have been able to upload those given the fact that there was no satellite service out of Tonga at the time. They would have had to upload those via the international cable. And it's very, very clear that the international cable was still operating at the time. So I got in touch with Shane Cronin and I asked him, hey, what's happening here? Why would the cable fail literally an hour 45 minutes after the explosion, and quite a considerable time after the tsunami as well? And so basically, the next thing that happened is the cable was was out of service. And the only thing that worked were sort of very low bandwidth satellite telephones and a bit of high-frequency communication from various embassies and high commissions in Nuku'alofa. And then Shane Reti, the national MP, basically sent a tweet off to Elon Musk and said, hey, can you help? And Elon's first response was, nah, probably not really. So that was honest. And then later on, he basically realized, hey, this is a way of showcasing what Starlink can do. And he dispatched a team of engineers to Fiji to put in a gateway at Suva. And I actually went public at the time and I said, look, this is really a bit of a non-starter because Tonga's too far away from Fiji for proper service, and there's also other reasons why it doesn't work around there. I mean, we already know the satellite density up there, so Tonga's about 20 degrees south. Satellite density is quite low, but also, and this is an important thing, is because it's close to the equator, there's another thing, and this is regulatory. So when you have a low Earth orbit satellite and you're in a part of the world where when you're transmitting up to the satellite and there happens to be within 18 degrees of that satellite happens to be a geostationary satellite in the background, then you're not allowed to transmit. So all those little dishy terminals that Starlink uses, by the way, dishy doesn't mean that it's a dish, it's a so-called phased array, which is actually quite an engineering achievement for Starlink. Previously, this sort of technology was used by the military and cost millions of dollars each. Now they bought it into a box that's about $1,000 US ballpark. And so basically, they went to all this effort, and then they sent 50 terminals, or just over 50 terminals, to Tonga. And they got a lot of media mileage out of this. Basically, Starlink comes to the rescue, and da-da-da-da-da. And all great and wonderful, except there were geostationary providers who thrown over a gigabit per second of capacity at Tonga already at the time. They didn't really even get a foot in the door publicity-wise, despite the fact that some of them were really doing it out of the goodness of their heart more than anything. And then, of course, Starlink only went live a day after the international cable got reconnected to Tonga Tapu, which removed literally about almost 90% of the need for connectivity that had existed beforehand, and literally restored this to them. Ever since, it's not quite clear what's happened to those 50 terminals, but apparently, intermittently, when a satellite was in the right position, they were able to give really, really good data rates, hundreds of megabits per second. But that's not surprising because they would have been the only users on the satellite. So, just looking at that international cable from Tonga, there's a little curiosity I want to point out to you. And again, this sort of came out of me reaching out to Shane Cronin from Geology, who's the resident volcanologist here at the University of Auckland, who looks after Honga Tonga. And if you've sort of seen international media, he's been out on the BBC a few times and elsewhere. the snorkeling professor. And Shane basically and I were sort of looking at traces as to where the cable ship went, because there was very sparse communication coming from the cable ship, and whatever came via Tonga cable. And they, of course, didn't have a good connection themselves, so they got very, very trickle data. So we looked at what came off the AIS positioning system on the boat. And so we could see the close of Tonga Tapu. So the squiggly line that you see here, this is the nominal cable route. And what they were trying to do is they were basically trying to find the end of the cable, or cable pieces that they could reuse, because they didn't have enough cable on board. They had 60 kilometers of cable on board when they left from the depot in Suva. Every cable spare that they could find in the entire Pacific that was compatible with the cable, they took. And they had to repair 90 kilometers of cable. So they actually had to pull some off that cable. And the cable that's down there is very, very similar to the one that's passing around at the moment. And they had to fish stuff off the seafloor in order to get at it. And of course, we were quite interested to see what they would find on the seafloor. And over here in this Western Theatre of Operations, so Eastern Theatre of Operations, there was a Western Theatre as well, they were able to use their remote operated underwater vehicle, and they sort of traced, and ever so often they brought a piece up. This is what you can sort of see as those perpendicular lines here. These are so-called holding drives, where basically the cable ship goes, drags a kind of a plow behind it, and the plow basically picks up the cable and brings it up to the surface. And then they were basically following further on with their remotely operated vehicle, and you can see over here, suddenly they're diverted from the nominal cable route by about 5 kilometers, where they finally picked up the end of the cable. Now, can I point something out to you? This is the direction to the volcano. The volcano is up here somewhere. Right? Now, normally, when you think about an explosion, and you've all seen Hollywood movies with explosions and people sort of flying through the air and all this sort of stuff, right? They fly away from the point of explosion. The point of explosion, the point of explosion was up here. And this traveled about 5 kilometers towards the point of explosion. And not only did it do that, it also traveled several hundred meters uphill, right? Which basically shows you that things that happen underwater are sometimes really, really, really weird. And so we don't know at this point whether this is a pyroclastic density current that came off Tonga that did this and that sneaked around. And they do this quite a bit. Neva's done a few simulations on this, and if I'd had a bit more time, I would have possibly shown you one of those. But basically, there's also the possibility that a slope at a seamount a bit further south would have been triggered that would have washed this further up. To give you an idea just of scale here, this is like having a cable like this here and seeing it washed up at Rangitoto. So this is the sort of stuff that you're having involved here. So what this tells us, though, is that fiber optic cables, as great as they are, if there's only one of them, you have essentially a single point of failure. And those pyroclastic density currents, or for that matter, turbidity currents, which is the more general class, so pyroclastic means it's caused by a volcano. So what these do is they're known to kill undersea cables. There's a very well-known case from 1929, the Great Banks earthquake off Alaska, where one of those currents went down a slope, and they had about a dozen transatlantic cables running across that slope, even back in 1929, and it took out one after the other over a time period of about 12 hours. And literally the position of the cable determined when it got taken out. Here it was a bit more complicated. This cable probably got taken out further west first by a current that sneaked round from the eastern side of Tonga around the north of Tonga and came down on the western side, whereas this one probably got taken out a little earlier. I mean, that's the going theory at the moment anyway. Okay, so let's bring Starlink into the Pacific here for a moment, or some other low Earth orbit operator that uses the same type of business model. And what they do is they don't go and talk to ISPs normally. They tend to like to talk really to the end user immediately. So basically what you have is you have your own personal satellite link at home. And so if we have a cat video that's going viral, then there's no way of placing one of those content delivery servers on the island. So we have to bring all of those cat videos for all of the 1,000 users on the island over the satellite link individually every time. And that's quite a bit of a strain on the resources, on the bandwidth that we've got available totally on those satellites. To give you a bit of an idea, the current total estimated system capacity of Starlink is less than the total connected capacity of Australia and New Zealand together. And this is the worldwide capacity for Starlink, right? Not just for our part of the world here. And we use, for our terrestrial cable connections, we use content delivery services for good reason. And here they can't really avail themselves of those because of that particular business model that they've chosen. So, okay. So going back to Starlink for a moment, again, so low Earth orbit satellites such as Starlink, they can only basically at this point bridge between two ground stations, and they can only do this for a short time. So basically this is because they fly on fairly quickly, and we've seen this in the simulation earlier on. So what this means is that sooner or later, one of the satellites will go so low down to the horizon that it'll basically set like the sun or the moon, and you can't see it anymore, and then you can't communicate with it anymore. So you need to hand over to another satellite. If that works and that's workable, okay, hunky-dory. If that's not workable, what you have to do is you have to use inter-satellite routing, and this means using one or more additional satellites as intermediate stepping stones between your internet gateway ground station and the end user ground station. So the question is, how do you find a route between two ground stations in a network like this? So when we teach our students, our graduate students, or sometimes final year students about routing, we tell them about algorithms such as Dijkstra's or Bellman-Ford or link states or OSPF or whatever, right? So the problem with all of these is that they really assume that your network's going to be fairly static, so that any changes to the network are relatively infrequent, and that when they do happen, they basically propagate over a certain amount of time across the network to where the information needs to sit. The problem that you're having here, and this is really now time to get the movie going. Yep. So the problem that you're having here is, of course, it's all really moving quickly, right? And so, moreover, even over the ground stations, you're not dealing with the same satellite that you're uplinking to or downlinking from every time. So what can we do here? And so when you're talking to Starlink, or rather what Starlink have let the world know, and they're very, very secretive, they don't really like talking to scientists. We tell too many things to too many people. They're going to be using space lasers, which sounds really great. You all know this from from Star Wars and Spaceship Enterprise and stuff like this. So we all know space lasers are a great thing, right? This is what they use in the movies. But they're not really telling us about how those space lasers work or how many they're going to have on each satellite. So I'm going to tell you a little bit why this makes a difference. So assuming for a moment that you have a bunch of low Earth orbit satellites, and they all have 3 space lasers each, and we're going to point them at the closest neighboring satellites in order to make that communication work, and somehow those neighboring satellites will pick this up. So this is what we get with this bunch of satellites here, and so some links going on further away from this. But that immediately causes us a problem. So if we're having a transmitting inter-satellite link, it's very straightforward, because what we need is a laser, a gimbal, to point that laser at a remote receiver at another satellite. And so basically the number of gimbals that we need on our satellite to do this is essentially the number of outgoing links. But now we have essentially a design choice to make on the receiving satellite. So what we can do is we can, for example, take a zoom lens and point it back at the transmitting satellite. The advantage of this is that we can discriminate between very, very small nuances of brightness on the incoming laser, which actually allows us to use those differences in brightness to send additional information over that laser link, right? But when we do this, then we really have to decide how many receiving zoom lenses we're going to allow ourselves to have, And immediately we run into a problem because the number of outgoing links to nearest neighbors that we're going to have is not necessarily the number of ingoing links that we need, because the say 3 nearest neighbors that we have, we may not be among the 3 nearest neighbors of those 3 neighbors, right? So they don't necessarily point something back at us. Moreover, other satellites who are not among our 3 nearest neighbors may be pointing their lasers back at us, and we need some way of receiving those. So the question is, are we going to have more gimbals with receivers? Of course we could do this, and the question is, how many do we need? And of course all this drives the cost per satellite up, and it also makes the satellite more complex, more prone to failure, and that sort of thing, right? So this is a bit of an issue. So the other problem that you can get is if you only go to your closest neighbor, then you might get clusters forming, basically subsets of satellites that are all among their own closest neighbors, and that way, if you're trying to forward inter-satellite, you can only forward within that little group, you never get to the rest of the world with it. So all those are issues, and in order to really tell what Starlink's going to do when they're going to bring their space lasers into operation, we'd need to know all this, but they're not really telling, right? So anyway, we're speculating as to what they might do, and as part of the speculation, Toby Tompkinson, who was my research assistant and is sort of shaping up to be a good graduate student in the department, he basically spent the tail end of a summer project with me, did something else for the summer project, but then had a bit of time left. So he spent time on simulating a protocol here, which we've developed and which we've just recently submitted a paper for on. And so the idea here is that we're assuming that we're using receivers that are omnidirectional. So we're not using a zoom lens here, we're using a wide-angle lens. And so this means we can take as many incoming lasers as we want. This might affect the bitrate a little bit, but then so be it. And so what we're also doing is we're saying, okay, the receiving ground station will have a particular IP version 6 address. Now, IP version 6 addresses, they're the new internet addresses. They've been around for about 10 years, and there's gazillions of them. So there's plenty of them. And so the idea is that every geographical location on Earth should be associated with a subset of those IPv6 addresses. So when an uplinking gateway or a satellite that's meant to forward to a particular destination sees this IPv6 address, it can look up where the geographical coordinates of the destination ground station are. So what it will do is it will then compute a great circle path to their destination. And great circle paths are something that people who do flying, for example, know. This is the shortest distance across the curvature of the Earth to a particular destination. And so the idea is we're now going to be using an n nearest neighbor routing to try and get to that destination. And so if we start off with 3 outgoing inter-satellite links, and Ben, if you could start that, please. Then, yeah, it's not, yeah, so, okay, so this is just my spiel. So if we forward a little bit, so we get, yep, that's, okay, we should be very shortly. Okay, so if we're doing this and we only have 3 links available, this is the cheap version of the satellite, remember, only 3 outgoing lasers, we get stuff that's only going off vaguely in the correct direction, but it can go in loops and bounds and bits and pieces like this, right? And it's anything but a direct path, and it's not really desirable. Now, if you're willing to go up to sort of mid-range satellite and you're allowing yourself 2 more gimbals and you have 5, then you can see it gets a lot smoother. We're staying a lot closer to the direct path here. By the way, this is a path between Auckland and Pitcairn Island. Mutiny off the, on the Bounty, in case you can't remember what Pitcairn's all about. So it's a few dozen people over there. And so you can see it's a lot better. But if we allow ourselves to have 8 outgoing links, then you can see we're getting even smoother. So basically, the more we spend on our satellite, the more gimbals for outgoing links we use, the more smoothly we can route this, and the better a result we get. So the neat thing about this particular routing algorithm is that we can really distribute this across the satellite fleet Nobody has to have a complete picture about where the other satellites are. It works with multiple shells of satellites where we have not just one constellation, but multiple constellations interacting with each other. So, and we're thinking that maybe this is what Starlink might be doing. But again, we'll find out next year, hopefully, maybe, if they're willing to talk to us about this. So, hang on. Right, and that really brings me to my conclusion. And I've gone a bit over time. So basically, getting people to use cloud computing requires a good internet connection. A lot of people out there don't have this. And there's no real silver bullet to solve that problem. Satellite service is expensive. It's not ideal. It's low performance generally. But the good thing is that progress in the satellite domain is being made. Whether that'll be able to eventually provision systems that will allow us to get these places to catch up, I don't know. Cables are much better, but that's obviously a matter of finding the money to get them there, and they're quite expensive to put in. But as we've seen in Tonga, they can also present single points of failure. And so one of the things that I'm currently sort of trying to do is wave the idea under people's noses that if we're wanting to keep islands in the Pacific in our good books, and I think the Australian and New Zealand government and maybe the American government are just waking up to this, then it might just be a good idea to actually pay for those cables. And the reason why this is also important is because as we, in New Zealand look at our own connectivity, we've only got 5 outgoing cables, right? And the more cables we have, the harder it gets to cut those cables and pretend that it wasn't anybody's fault. And also, we get a lot more resilience and robustness in the Pacific-wide system. And these cables, while they're expensive to lay, they're a hell of a lot cheaper than all the military hardware that people tend to send around this part of the world in order to protect their assets here. So basically, for one frigate, you can buy 2 or 3 trans-Pacific cables, and then if you have sort of, islands in the Pacific that are, sort of nodes that bring several cable systems together, then that would add quite a bit of resilience together. And so I'm currently trying to wave this under people's noses a bit, because I think that would make a lot of sense. And also, it would, of course, help our friends in the islands to finally fully partake in cloud computing and all the benefits that has to offer real cloud computing, because the personal clouds are already available in the islands. So Starlink and other LEO systems, they're certainly part of the picture, but they're not a cure-all because of the limited capacity they have and because of the business models that they use. But they can certainly fill gaps, and they can be a good backstop on things. And I think that's probably where they're going to be sitting, at least for the medium term. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for paying attention tonight. And I hope you found this interesting. And if you've got any questions, then of course I'm here for that.
So, long term, 100 years from now, is it going to be all cable, or is satellite still going to play a part?
This depends a lot on whether we'll still be able to launch satellites in 100 years' time. At the moment, the amount of junk that we're putting up there is humongous. So it's something I didn't really talk about. So basically, in 100 years' time, will we have cables? Will we have satellites? So I think we'll have a lot more cables than we have now. People will see this as a far more necessary part of infrastructure. It'll be part of education. It'll be part of just general disaster resilience and stuff like this. I mean, if you look at Tonga, for example, the amount of money that was spent by bringing the wrong aid deliveries together and transporting them to Tonga just to find out that they weren't needed over there because there was too little bandwidth from Tonga to communicate to New Zealand what people actually needed, that alone makes projects like that to a good extent worthwhile. And the other thing that's around it is certainly resilience against natural disasters, resilience against foreign malicious actors, going around cutting cables. And, for example, it's well known that, for example, the Russians have been, around Europe and the Mediterranean, have been showing an unnatural large amount of interest with their research ships, in various international cable locations. So this is very much on the radar of foreign militaries, I can tell you that one. But ultimately, I think we'll probably see a lot more cable. We'll probably see better satellite systems than we have them at the moment. But I think satellite ultimately will probably be more a backstop, and it'll be more something that'll be handling Internet of Things in remote locations where you simply cannot run a cable. So for example, if we're going to aircraft, if we're going to ships, and there's a lot of talk at the moment, for example, about robotic ships and robotic aircraft that are crewless, pilotless, and in order to control those in international airspace or on the high seas, you do need satellite capacity and satellite facilities in order to control those and monitor those. And I think this is probably more where the satellites will eventually end up serving. That, of course, all assumes that a lot of the islands that we'd like to serve now will still be above water in 100 years' time. So that's also one of those things. Right, further questions? Right.
So one of the problems is that where the cables are landing, they don't have then the actual infrastructure for. I mean, they might have like very old machines. I mean, most of them I think they're running copy software. So when you talk about like having the benefits of cloud going to these islands, I think there are other kind of.
There's certainly other kind of issues. You're absolutely right. And in fact, the bad connectivity is actually partly at the root of those issues. Now, there's a little nice story to tell here. So in 2015, I was working up on a project in the Cook Islands, and I was talking to the then head of the internet the Internet Society in the Cook Islands. And I found out that internet users in the Cook Islands were really, really angry with Telecom Cook Islands for basically providing such a bad service. And I kept telling them, look, it's not really their fault. It's all they can afford. And it's the best they can do. And they haven't designed the TCP protocol, so they can't really prevent that Tcpq oscillation. And then one day I got an absolute irate email from the woman, and she basically said, they've gone really through the roof. They've charged a lot of us hundreds of dollars in excess data volume fees. So what had happened? This was the time when Microsoft started rolling out Windows 10. And Microsoft was really, really generous. If you had a previous Windows version and you had automatic updates turned on, as had a lot of the Internet Society people in the islands, then you would be getting all the pre-installed files for Windows 10 put onto your machine for free upgrade, just in case you wanted it as part of your monthly update cycle. All 5.6 gigabytes of it. So the problem with that, of course, is that a lot of people in the Cook Islands at the time were on 1 gigabyte or 2 gigabyte a month plans. So this really put them out of their quota, and a lot of them. And of course, the billing software at Telecom Cook Islands completely ignored this. They just got billed for what extra they used. And a lot of them weren't even aware that this had happened. In fact, there was almost nothing you could find about it. I happened to stumble about the answer to the riddle by coincidence on a German mailing list, where people said, hey, what's that funny folder in your Windows root directory, all about? And then somebody said, oh, it's the Windows 10 upgrade files. And so I read that, and I sent an email to my contact in the Cook Islands and said, look, can you go to your machine and tell me whether you've got the following folder on your machine and how big it is and how old it is. And she got back to me and said, yeah, it's all there in this 5.6 gigabytes, and said, look no further, that's what's cost you all that money. And it's actually Microsoft's fault. They assumed that everybody would have a great internet connection and tried to be very generous with everybody, but they didn't take into account that there were people on volume charging in the Cook Islands and probably elsewhere who got hit very, very badly with this. And in the end, they sort of split the bill. I think Telecom Cook Islands gave everybody an extra 2 or 3 gigabytes for that month, and then billed them for the rest. But this is the sort of stuff that can happen. And of course, what also happens security-wise is that because it's so difficult to download any file of any length, and this TCpQ oscillation is quite insidious. So if you only have a very, very small file to download, so your typical web browsing consists of mostly small files, that's okay. But when you're then having a large download to make, like a large video in one block, or you're having a large piece of software to download, like your typical software upgrades, your typical Windows cap files and so on, that is enormously enormously time-consuming because TCP under Q oscillation slows down to a very, very low rate. And so a lot of people get frustrated with this, and that's why they're turning anything off that's slowing their internet connection down, and this very often means that automatic updates get turned off. And so as a result of that, what happens typically when one of those countries switches from satellite to cable, the next thing that they're getting is a serious infestation of malware all around the island, because literally the whole full force of the internet now hits a fleet of machines that haven't been upgraded in years. And so what organizations like APNIC, for example, have been doing to combat this is that before that connection happens, they send a team with the latest patches into the islands, and they try and upgrade as many machines as possible up there as they possibly can in order to minimize the impact of this. Now, of course, they don't ever catch everybody. You wouldn't catch everybody here if you did this. But it certainly mitigates the impact, and especially it makes sure that professional users in the islands, the companies, the people who are running significant mission-critical servers, that at least they're protected and that they're up to date with their last stuff. But it's the sort of stuff you need to anticipate, most certainly. Right. Further questions? Yes?
So you were talking before about keeping Pacific Islands, and keeping in their good graces when you're talking about especially New Zealand, Australia, and the US. I was also wondering, are there any proposals from either the US or China for, because I know with there's this race for the Pacific now where you've got deals with the Solomon Islands and Fiji. Are there proposals from either of the kind of big players for connectivity for the Pacific?
Okay, so I'll make a repeat question. So the question is, are there any proposals from the big players involved in the tussle around political influence in the Pacific as to communications? And yes, you bet the Chinese have spotted this. You may be aware that the Chinese foreign minister is currently touring the Pacific. And before he went on the trip, he said he was definitely wanting to talk to countries about communications. I'm aware, I'm having an incoming PhD student on a New Zealand government scholarship from Kiribati, and he told me recently that the Kiribati government has been approached by the Chinese about, maybe we can make an additional satellite channel available to you, or maybe an entire satellite or something like this. And you could also see this, for example, after the Tongan volcano. I mean, when the Chinese turned up with their ship, they had 500 flat pack houses on that ship, right? And that was way more aid than the Australians and the New Zealanders and everybody else brought in combined, right? Whether they needed the flat pack houses, I'm not entirely sure, but I think they got them now. But obviously, these are things that are part of the game of influence in the Pacific, which has been played for decades. And the funny thing is that communication is now sort of going a much more center stage compared to what it used to be beforehand. And again, it's probably a relatively cheap way of integrating the Pacific and making sure that they're not being treated like a backwater. Because at the moment, what we're doing is we're basically leaving it up to individual Pacific islands to go and say, we'd really like to have cable. And so the next thing that happens is they go to the World Bank and say, how many million are you willing to loan us? They go to the Asian Development Bank, how many million are you willing to loan us? Then they're going to go to all sorts of other donors, USAID, NZAID, AusAid, and so on. And they're basically literally groveling for money. They're taking out loans. They're leaning on all sorts of in sometimes fairly dodgy ways, just in order to bring the finance together. And then once they've got the system put in, they sit on a huge loan that they sometimes have difficulty paying back. And at the same time, for example, we in the School of Computer Science are under constant pressure to improve outcomes for our Pacific Island students. Now, a great deal of the problem that we're facing is that a certain percentage of our Pacific Island students, for example, during COVID, were actually in the islands. They couldn't come here. And what did we do? We threw all of the lectures onto video, and well, try and watch a video through one of those geostationary satellite links. Good luck. I mean, you can wait for a day for a 10-minute video to download. So they were literally cut off from what we were doing. And so for all practical purposes, it makes them feel like they're forgotten, they're like they're a backwater. And, yes, they are a long way away, but they're on the way to somewhere else, right? They're on the way between us and the US, right? A large amount of the data that we're consuming here in New Zealand comes from the United States or through the United States. Almost every internet content that we're getting from Asia, almost every internet content that we're getting obviously from North America, but almost every internet content that we're getting from Europe as well comes via the United States. And there's a lot of islands between us and the United States. And in order to add resilience to that path, we'd be much, much better off investing in that infrastructure going over there and at the same time integrating the islands and giving them those much needed second and third cables as well, right? I mean, Tonga, I've had the former CEO of Tonga Cable write to me and say, Ulrich, with all you found out about what happened to our cable there, does it even make sense, given the number of volcanoes that we have in the vicinity, does it even make sense to lay cables there? And I said, yes, as long as you lay more than one cable and you keep them spatially apart so that a single volcanic eruption doesn't take all of them out. And but this is something that the Pacific Islands themselves can't lift. And for us it might be something, we've got 4 or 5 cables, this is fine. But the question is, what would we do in a crisis situation? What would we do, for example, if a single cable access point, say, for example, we have a large volcanic eruption in the north of Auckland. It takes out the cable path to Takapuna Beach, where the Southern Cross cable goes from. It takes out the domestic cable path to Mangawhai Heads. It takes out the path to the telecom satellite ground station near Warkworth, and it takes out some of the cable path over to Morawai. Well, at that point, we were almost cut off, right? And basically 3/4, 80%, or more of our cable capacity disappears in an instant, right? And okay, these are black swan events, but we do know black swan events happen from time to time. And the question is, are we a big enough economy so we want to take that risk, right? And the simple answer is, I think we're a big enough economy, and we're connected to big enough economies further west and further north, Fiji and so on, that we probably should think about whether this is something that we would want to afford. And so that definitely goes into that category. Yeah.
As a token of appreciation, I'd like to actually give you a little.
Thank you.